Hey, it's Sarah Burke here from the Women in Media podcast. And before we get started on a new episode, could I get you to hit like, follow, subscribe, hit the bell, whichever app you do your podcast listening in. Make sure you're all set up so you know when there's a new episode and you can help spread the word. Oh, and if you're so inclined, could I ask you to leave a review if the app that you're using does that? You're the best. All right, let's get to the show. I'm Sarah Burke, and this is the Women in Media podcast. My guest today is an award-winning radio personality from Toronto, now hosting a nationally syndicated radio show in Philly. I would guess that you'd be familiar with her work from the CBC here in Toronto, Indie 88, and 102.1 The Edge, where she actually trained me on the board back in the day.
One of the reasons I wanted to leave Toronto was because I didn't know where to go from where I was. As far as music went, it didn't feel like there were a lot of options for me at that moment, and I wanted something new. There was a whole bunch of uncharted stuff for me to explore.
My last guest of 2022 is Raina Douris, the host of NPR's World Cafe. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for your patience. I know that it's been like a nightmare trying to get a date down, so I really appreciate it. I'm glad we actually are doing it.
I'm super intrigued about your move down to the States and all the differences between the Canadian market and the American market. But I think we got to start with who you work for, because to the average Canadian, including me, this is a little confusing. If I have this right, you technically work for WXPN, but it's also NPR?
Yes. So WXPN is owned by the University of Pennsylvania, and it is a community-supported public radio station. So it's mostly listener supported. Listeners are our biggest source of funding. And we produce the show here, and then it is distributed by NPR. It's one of the sort of public broadcasters. It's the national public radio, but the whole system here is just slightly different. There are lots of public radio distributors. There's things like PRX and various other places that do distribute national or public programming. It gets confusing. I'm only starting to just understand how it all works. Technically, I'm an employee of the University of Pennsylvania. So I like to tell people I work for an Ivy League university. But yeah, I'm kind of under a bunch of different umbrellas.
Is it safe to assume that the impact you have on your listeners is so much greater because it's publicly funded like the CBC here?
I mean, I think that, having worked at the CBC, which is also listener funded, just in a very different way that is much more compulsory, I think that that your audience wants to hear you. You know that if what you're doing is resonating, you get to hear from people on a really personal level when they become members of the radio station, that sort of thing. When I do fund drives a couple times a year, we do them at WXPN, and you get messages from listeners who write in, and you really kind of get this feeling for the sense of community. So that, I think, at least from my side of the microphone, the interactions that you have are the percentage of positive interactions you have is higher. That does not to say that at the CBC you wouldn't have positive interactions. You do all the time. The CBC is like a beloved institution. But then there are the people who really, really hate it, who want to defund it and all that stuff that you're sort of dealing with because, it's part of their lives whether they want it to be or not. And I'm not saying one model is necessarily better than the other because I think there are big pros for both. But as a host, the feedback I get probably is on the whole more positive working at a listener-supported station.
And because you've worked in public radio in Canada as well as private radio, is there a favorite?
That's hard because they are all great for different reasons. I really love working in the environment I'm in now because it does sort of feel like a combination of some of my favorite parts of other places that I've been. So it has the kind of, we're publicly funded and we are community supported feeling of, public radio. But then it has this sort of, because of the place that I work, WXPN in Philly, because we're not at NPR headquarters, we're kind of in our own little rock station world. It still feels kind of like Indie 88 and this sort of scrappy, we're going to pull together and do a big fun countdown, or we're going to we're really close to our listeners. Like there's this sort of on the street level that we have going on here. And I think like, one of my favorite things about radio is that connection that you're able to make. And even though I'm a national show and I hope to make that connection with people across the country, I also love that we have sort of the local side of things and I get to kind of be part of the community on a local level. That is harder when you're working at somewhere like someplace like the CBC where you're doing a national morning show that goes across the country and it's not really supposed to necessarily be based in Toronto. It's supposed to appeal to everybody, right? So you're not really doing those like meet people on the street sort of things. I love doing live radio. So when I get to do that here sometimes on the local station, it's such a treat. And yeah, I guess I don't know how to exactly answer that question, but I think like when I've been lucky enough to do all of these things and sort of figure out the parts that I really love.
Yeah, that's fair. Very fair. Okay, so what about moving down to Philly? Like, how did this opportunity present itself? I know that there was a former CBCer in there before who you maybe had a connect with, but I figured it would have been a daunting thing, especially with what's gone on politically in both Canada and the U.S. over the last few years. I can't even imagine.
Yeah, I mean, I think moving to a new place anywhere is a big decision. I mean, I've lived my entire life in the Toronto area or Toronto itself before this. And when I applied for this job, it was the sort of thing where I was like, it's a good idea to apply for this stuff. I don't know if I would actually make the move. It's a pretty big decision, but I'm going to just apply and see how it goes. And you never know. And I'd always wanted to move to the States to work. And that's partly because there are so many more options. There are so many more people. There are so many more cities, and that means there are more places to work. But yeah, when it was happening, when it finally kind of came down to it, and I went for my interview, I flew down here, and I was really on the fence. And I came for like my final interview, and I'm like, I don't know, I'm just gonna see what happens. And I walked into this building here, and I was like, oh, I love it. Like I loved it right away. But when I would tell people, this was 2019. Fall of 2019, telling people that I'm going to move to the States now from Canada. I got a lot of people saying, are you sure you want to do that? It's politically very tumultuous right now. There's like gun violence. Yeah, all those things are true. But there is this idea of what living in the States is going to be like that is painted on TV, on the news in Canada, that is not totally reflective of what it's actually like to live downtown in a city in America. I mean, living in Philly versus living in Toronto, it's not that different as far as your day-to-day life, except that Philly's more affordable to live in. Like there's, and there are like, there's things. The healthcare thing was a really weird adjustment. Was confusing and intimidating, and still is. I don't love that, but I do love sort of, at least in Philadelphia, it's a very vibrant place and the music scene is very much alive and just getting to experience a different sort of media landscape has been really interesting. I had to learn when I got down here because of CanCon, there's a whole section of like bands that I know really, really well that like don't really have the same established presence down here. But instead, there's all these other bands I haven't heard of that got replaced with CanCon bands on Canadian radio. So I had to like learn about all of these bands that are, pretty big here, kind of medium level, that I'd never heard of in my life. That suddenly it was like, oh, you don't know them? It's like, yeah, I don't, because they were always like, a different band was always kind of put in that slot. But yeah, the move was big. It was like it's an 8-hour drive. It's an 1.5-hour flight. It's not so bad, but it feels far enough that I get homesick. The other night, Bob Cajun came on this station down here by Tragically Hip. They never really play Tragically Hip, but we're doing this big 90s thing right now. And I was lying in bed and I was listening to it and I got really homesick. I was like, oh no, I miss Canada. I miss it.
And equally like shocking to even hear it in the first place there.
Oh, I know. It's amazing the stuff that you don't think you will miss that you end up missing when you move somewhere else. Where I'm like, oh man, I miss Timbits. It's like I didn't care about Timbits when I lived in Canada. Now I
Yeah.
want one. Like,
Okay. So when she's home for the holidays, are you coming home for the holidays, by the way?
yes, I am. Yeah.
Get yourself some damn Timbits, please. The job itself, walking into a broadcasting establishment in the States as a Canadian, aside from learning music, what about like how you were received as a Canadian in an American radio landscape?
Well, fortunately, the person who was on this show before me was also Canadian.
Yes.
But I didn't realize how strong my accent was. And that took some time to kind of get used to. There'd just be words that people would be like, okay, so here's a great example. I was interviewing Barbara Streisand. No big deal. But I said something. I can't remember what the word was that I said, but she stopped me. And she's like, what did you just say? And I said it again. And she goes, are you Canadian? And she then started to quiz me on different Canadian pronunciations of things. Like Chianti, we say Chianti, the wine. That's not how you say it here. I think they say Chianti. Pasta and pasta are different. Like things that I never really thought about. That you just, or about, a word I say constantly. And I now hear a boot all the time. But I mean, ultimately, it's all pretty similar. People are really, really nice about it. I think people like Canadians. It's, we're seen as like funny, nice people. At least in America. So that helps. Most people don't notice until they realize that you have a bit of an accent. And then, then they'll say something like, oh, I've only ever been to Montreal.
And you're like, cool.
Or, my family went to Niagara Falls once. And then also nobody knows how far away anything is in Canada. Like no one knows that Vancouver and Toronto are like across the
not
country
beside
from
each other.
Yeah.
Awesome. You basically started your job by the time you were getting comfortable in your role, the pandemic hits. I mean, I've seen your stuff online over the last 2 years, and I don't know if you felt this. I certainly did. It became easier and more attainable to get like these guests that were doing the same thing that me and you are doing right now, talking to people over a screen.
Yeah.
What was your like greatest interview moment? You've had so many great guests on your show over the last little while. Like, give me a couple just special moments.
Well, that Barbara Streisand thing was really great.
Yeah.
Interviewing Neil Young was probably the coolest thing I've gotten to do.
I would have shit my pants.
Oh my God, I was so nervous. I had 90 minutes with him, which is an incredibly long amount of time. And, I've loved Neil Young since I was a kid. My parents love Neil Young. There's a lot riding on this. Plus, it's like, yeah, I'm Canadian. I'm the Canadian one, right? At work, and it's like, okay, you guys don't even understand how big of a deal this is. And it was. I don't even know how to describe it. I mean, it was weird. Like, there's moments in it where you have to like stop yourself and just sort of look at it and be like, this is really happening. This is really happening right now. I'm talking to Neil Young, and he like knows that I exist, and he's talking to me. So that was really cool. Bruce Springsteen we just had on, which was pretty wild. He'd never been on the show before in the 30 years that World Cafes existed. So that was pretty exciing.
Maybe Neil gave him one of these. I don't know.
I like to think, yeah, he was just like, hey, we went on this show with this girl. She was really great. A big one for me. This has been really cool. One thing with World Cafe that I love is that we interview musicians, but we also interview musicians who aren't necessarily primarily known as musicians. So one of my first ones was Jeff Goldblum. Jeff Goldblum was like one of my first 5 interviews over the phone. Cool. He tried to get me to sing here's a Canadian thing, tried to get me to sing the Canadian national anthem in French. And I seriously regretted not paying attention to how to do that because I couldn't do it. And also Tim Heidecker, a comedian, or primarily a comedian before, now is both a musician and comedian. And, getting to talk to him was something that was really, really cool. There are so many. I mean, it's been really incredible. Like, there are many moments where I've had to stop and be like, you need to really savor that this is happening right now. Yeah. Because it's pretty unbelievable.
Well, it's also unbelievable even in like the context of this basically campus radio station having such clout that Bruce Springsteen and Neil Young will come on. I have heard the interviews. The interviews were amazing. I know what you bring to the table, but it's funny to me that World Cafe and WXPN have become these homes for such great artists.
World Cafe has really established itself over, I mean, like I said, it turned 30 in 2020, 2021?
Sometime when you were there.
It turned 30 in 2021. The show started in 1991. XPN was around before that. They have just really established a reputation as a place that really cares about music and that is really passionate. I mean, I know that when I started at Indie 88, the program director at the time, Adam Thompson, when I was starting as the music director and afternoon drive host, gave me a list of stations that we should be paying attention to that play great music. And a lot of those were college stations in the States. And XPN was on that list. The college radio sort of station landscape in the States is a lot stronger than, like, I don't want to say that because I've never worked in the Canadian college radio system, but the college radio charts would be in Rolling Stone magazine. Like they are tastemakers, right? People look to them, or at least have for a long time looked to them. Things are always changing, as we know, with streaming and everything, but they're still influential, especially when it comes to breaking kinds of music that don't necessarily have a home on a lot of other mainstream radio stations. So it is really pretty incredible when you think about it that way, that they're college stations that now have this huge reach.
I want to go back to like your radio days in Canada. So funny enough, I was thinking about this the other day. I feel like I'm like literally following in your footsteps sometimes because you trained me on the board at the Edge.
Yep.
And you end up at Indie 88. I work at Indie 88 now. I was thinking about what I used to remember about your shows on Indie 88. You know, I heard you talk a lot about mental health stuff. And now you're doing like primarily a music show. Do you find it harder to, like, I know you said you get to fill in sometimes for local radio. Do you bring that stuff into a show there, or has that been a big adjustment?
What I get to do on World Cafe is, you know, a lot of it, there's sort of two parts of the show. There's the first and second hour. The second hour is like kind of a more straight ahead, playing you songs, talking about the music. The first hour is the interview. And what the interview really lets me do is talk about all of those things that I used to have to keep in like a 20-second quick break, right? Now you can have conversations about all sorts of issues with an artist. And that kind of satisfies that. I mean, sure, I'm sure that if you just let me go off, I could go off on lots of different subjects. But music is a great lens through which to look at all of those things because it is such a human expression of like feelings and like emotions and experience and all of these things. There's really like no conversation you can't have when it comes to music. So that's been a really fun thing. It's let me kind of go beyond what I was able to do before.
What about the idea of like in Toronto being like a well-known personality on the air? I know I think anyway that you have that with World Cafe and have grown your presence already, even in the few years that you've been there. But was that idea of leaving this, like, I'm a well-known personality here, no one's going to know me there, did that ever go through your head?
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I lived in Toronto for like since I was 18 years old. It was everybody that I knew was there, and I felt like I knew everybody there in a way. Like, obviously I didn't, but like it felt...
In the scene, yeah.
When I went out, I would know somebody at whatever show I went to. And it was a very strange experience to move here. I mean, especially before my boyfriend moved here. I was like literally alone for the first time ever. And yeah, I would go to a show and everyone would look vaguely familiar because everyone kind of looks like everybody who's into like indie rock music kind of looks the same everywhere. Yeah. But I'd realize like, I'm like, I don't know any of these people. I don't know anybody. You're really starting not at square one because ultimately I also have a radio show and a whole station behind me, right? It's not like I'm moving to a new city with like nothing but a bindle and like a dream. Like I have something, but it is weird. It's like you have to start all over again at establishing yourself as somebody that, people can trust, that they hopefully will like. I think that having started, at the CBC, for instance, right after somebody people really loved, like Tom Power, I took over for Tom. People love Tom, and rightfully, because he's great. It took about 3 years for people to like care about who I was or like me or like develop that relationship. I'm starting to feel that that's like, I'm, about 3 years in, and I'm starting to feel like I'm getting that. Of course, we had the pandemic in between, so that kind of messed things up a little bit, but it is strange, but it's exciting because I think one of the reasons I wanted to leave Toronto was because I didn't know where to go from where I was unless I wanted to go into like hard J journalism, which I didn't think I really wanted to do, at least not at that point. And I still don't know if that would be the thing for me anyway. As far as music went, it didn't feel like there was a lot. There were a lot of options for me at that moment, and I wanted something new.
Maybe hit a ceiling.
In a way, I don't love to think about it exactly like that because I like to think that you can kind of create your own thing if you really want to. Sometimes that's really hard. But it did feel like I knew I wanted to go to the States because I knew that there were just more options. And I knew that like there was a whole bunch of uncharted stuff for me to like explore. And in Toronto, I kind of knew what the landscape was, and I kind of knew that there wasn't really anywhere for me to go at that point. It's weird. It's an ego thing too, right? Like you're like, oh, suddenly I'm somewhere else and no one gives a shit about who I am or anything I've ever done.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm lucky I have a very supportive team here and they've been like behind me the whole way. So yeah.
I hear a lot of myself in what you just said, and I'm playing with the idea of creation right now.
Yeah.
It's terrifying to do, especially when you find yourself not attached to an organization and you're just doing it on your own. It is terrifying, but I feel so much of what you just said.
I mean, I feel like right now is an interesting time to create your own things because you can. I mean, when I started in radio, I guess you could have an internet radio show, but like that, there was no podcasting wasn't a thing yet. Like
you were always creating your own thing though. If we go back to like, was it Alan Cross that you were an intern for?
No, I was just an intern at Chorus. So it was like in the digital department though. Yeah. I kind of did a little bit of everything, but I did, you're right. I did start a YouTube series.
I just remember like knowing more about the things that you did before you were on air at The Edge, like knowing more about the things you had created before that, which is interesting too, at this moment to think about that.
I think we're kind of, it's weird because like you and I think our whole careers probably, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but we've heard about how great it used to be in radio. Yeah. And that can be frustrating, and there are definitely times where that like gnaws at me a little bit. But we're also in a time where you can make something without having to be hired. You can make stuff without having to worry about following rules about like language or content or really anything. I mean, there's like music rights. That's still the big thing you have to contend with.
Yeah.
Which, that's good. But it's a very different world if you want to make something on your own. Obviously, the rules have shifted, but there are good things about it, too.
Yeah, for sure. I thought I would ask you about this, and if you ask me to take it out, I completely will. But I remember there being a time where, like, you were, like, holding a cigarette at a broadcast. It was, like, a totally other persona of you, you know? And I remember like you were suddenly gone from The Edge and there were all these like conversations swirling. Reflect on that compared to where you are now and what you like learned from the early parts of your career.
Yeah, I mean, I try to remember that when I was at The Edge, I was like 23, 24, maybe.
Yeah.
And I'd been interning there since I was in university. And I was a dumb idiot. I was like a very driven dumb idiot. And I think I was not equipped to handle a lot of like what was happening at that point. I was working weird hours and I was hanging out in cool places with cool people. And I was like, this is like, it was like, I was not being a responsible person. Let's just say that.
And for the record, I have also gone through this, for the record.
Yeah. Like it's, I think that if I went back in time, there are small things I probably would change, but I probably would have been the same person. Getting fired from the Edge after being an idiot was really good for me. It sucks that, that will always be a thing people might think about me, but I don't really care because I know that getting fired from that, it was humbling. It was a chance for me to think, okay, maybe I don't want to do radio. Maybe I want to do something else. Maybe I don't care about this. And then realize that, no, I did want to do it. And that if I was going to do it, I had to take things much more seriously. I think I also kind of felt like when I was there that no one was paying attention to what I was doing. And so whatever, I'll just do what I want. And, that's a dangerous spot to put yourself in. And I am, I went out for coffee a few years after that with the person who fired me. And I said, like, thank you. I know that it was hard. It was like a shitty situation. And I think if you had never done that, I could be in a much worse position now. I think that, like, it put this thing in me where I'm like, I need to, if I want to do this, I really have to bust my ass to do it. And
accountability lesson.
Exactly, that too. Yeah. And it's like, people can see you. Don't be an idiot. And that's like a lesson that every now and then I need to be reminded, I think, in smaller ways. But I think people who are good personalities on air are not always like going to behave in the most perfect way sometimes. And I'm not trying to give myself an excuse here, but like, I think that some of those compelling people are people who are complicated or are dealing with things or are, not just getting up, going to the gym every day, going to work, going to make their salad, like doing everything exactly perfect. Would it be nice to be able to like do that? Sure. Sometimes I am that person, but sometimes I'm not.
Humans are messy.
Yeah. And I also think that like, and this again, I'm not trying to excuse myself at all, but I don't know if you would agree with this. I think that there is a tendency to judge women harsher when they behave badly.
I was like, oh, I haven't asked her one thing about like her perception of being a female in this industry, but you're leading me right into it.
Yeah. I think the biggest thing that bothers me about being a woman in this industry, and it's not, I've been very fortunate. I've, gotten to do a lot of jobs that I didn't think were open to me when I first started in broadcasting. But I've also seen how there is still, even among people who would never, ever, ever want to say that they were like this, there is this feeling or this difficulty people have with women who have more than one dimension, who don't fit into like what people want them to be, who get angry, who have opinions, who, can be gross or like say things that, might be, and I'm not saying like offensive in any deep, horrible way, but like, might be kind of, iffy. But like, I guess I do think that there is still a resistance to letting women be full people, for better or for worse.
No, for sure. And the idea of like, some women maybe being confident enough to speak their mind or be a little more messy than the average, I think how many personalities at the Edge before you didn't get fired? That's where my brain goes. And it's just, I'm glad that it led you to such a, a great place that you are today.
Not to like toot my own horn here, but I'm very proud of myself that I didn't give up after that. And I didn't just say, oh, forget it. I'm too embarrassed or I'm like angry or whatever. Like, I'm glad that I didn't, because that would have been Would have been sad.
Yeah, and to be honest, like, look what you did after. Like, fuck them. It's fine.
It really, you just got to believe in yourself.
Okay, we only have a couple minutes left. So I want to ask you about this. You've been lecturing. Can you pronounce this for me? Chautauqua?
Chautauqua. I only did one lecture, to be fair. But
Okay.
Chautauqua, it's how do I even describe this? It was new to me when I was asked to do it. It's a very old institution where all summer long there's different weeks of themed programming, and there are lectures on different topics. And I'd never given a lecture. I was there for the Smithsonian Folkways Week, where I gave a lecture on folk music and trends in folk music and World Cafe's sort of role in music discovery and folk and all that stuff. And it was really cool. It was terrifying to write a lecture.
No, but so
Like,
fun.
no.
Like, you know what you're talking about when it comes to music discovery. Come on.
I know, but you know what I mean. When you're on the radio, you're writing for like 45 seconds at the most.
Right.
And I was like, I got to write 45 minutes? Like, I don't even know how to do that.
Funny enough, I did a lecture of some sort for my faculty I graduated from at Western. And it was just this year as well. And it wasn't in person or anything. So I didn't have like feedback. It was in some sort of platform where you couldn't tell what the audience, how they were reacting, but you could just see how many people were in the virtual room, like a number. And I found it so hard to not have feedback, like the way that you get texts or tweets from a radio station or calls. Like there was
Yes.
literally no way for me to know if anything I said landed. I found that so weird.
yeah.
But in your case, you were in person.
Yeah.
So
It was, I wore a suit and everything. I did say at the very beginning of my talk, I was like, it's really nice to be able to see all your faces, because
Yeah.
same kind of thing. Like, that immediate feedback is such a thrill.
that's why you like live radio,
I do. Yeah.
I think. So one thing I like to do at the end of every Women in Media podcast episode, I ask for you to nominate some women that you would love to hear more about on, in a long form conversation type of way. Can be anyone that you respect who's a woman or female identifying person in the media.
I feel like you've probably talked to, like, here's one of the sad things is, like, there are not enough women in the Canadian media world. Let me just think for
Behind
one
the scenes
second.
is cool too.
Yeah. I'm sure you've talked to Lana.
Lana Gay?
Yeah. Or Nanaba Duncan at CBC. She's really smart, funny. She's worked on like all sides of production and on air, and she's awesome.
No,
She's
I
amazing.
haven't talked to either of them. I mean, Lana, I see every day. I will literally see her in an hour, and I have not had her on yet.
Lana knows so much stuff. She's so interesting. She knows so much. Yeah, I mean, you work with some really incredible women that I love a lot. Marjorie Malpass was a talent coach that I had. She is awesome. I had her right before I got this job and right before I was at the CBC. And there's stuff that she taught me that was so pivotal for me. Just really changed how I thought about a lot of stuff. And then at CBC, Anne McKeegan, she's one of the people who runs Q. She was one of the people who was sort of in charge of CBC Music when I was there. Oh, you know who I think you'd really like talking to?
Who?
Is Jess Huddleston. She worked at CBC as well now. She works at Spotify Canada. She's really cool.
Thank you so much for making the time. I know you've been super busy down there, and safe travels for the holidays, and keep doing you. I love everything that you said today.
Sarah, thank you so much.
And there you have it, my last Women in Media conversation of 2022. I'm going to take a little break over the holidays as I line up new guests for 2023. A reminder, there are 48 episodes of this thing with fantastic guests that you can either revisit or listen to for the first time, because I'm sure you missed one or two over the course of the year. I'll do a little holiday brainstorming too, because we're coming up on episode 50. I feel like I got to throw a party or something. Either that or score a slam dunk of a guest. Stay tuned. More great conversations coming in 2023. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Holidays, whatever you celebrate. I hope that you've got some time to put your feet up over the next few weeks, and I'll talk to you in the new year.
A woman of ill repute is a person who's found success in non-traditional ways, often risking the disapproval of society. They're usually fearless, and more often than not, they're quite funny. They're certainly interesting, and sometimes inspirational. I'm Maureen Holloway, and along with my friend, noted broadcaster Wendy Besley, we talk to these women on our podcast, and we call it Women of Ill Repute. You might like it. Lots of people do. And all you have to do is listen on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or you could go to our website at womenofillrepute.com. That's kind of our online home. And while you're there, it wouldn't hurt you to sign up for our newsletter. I'm just saying.
Another Sound Off Media Company podcast.